The crystal award felt heavier than it should have in my 73-year-old hands as I stood at the podium, looking out at 300 faces in the grand ballroom of the Riverside Convention Center. The weight wasn't from the glass itself. It was from the 15 years of 18-hour days, sleepless nights, and sheer determination that this Regional Business Leader Award represented. When my husband, Calvin, died 15 years ago, I began, my voice steady despite the familiar tightness in my chest that always accompanied mentions of my loss. He left me with more than grief. He left me with $42,000 in debts I never knew existed, a foreclosed home, and a choice: surrender to circumstances or fight back. The audience leaned forward. I could see nods of recognition, particularly from the women my age scattered throughout the crowd. These were my people, survivors who understood that starting over at 58 wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. I chose to fight from a card table in my niece's spare bedroom. I built Blackwood Financial Consulting into what you see today. 35 employees, offices in 3 states, and the privilege of helping other women navigate financial crises with dignity and hope. The applause was warm, genuine. I smiled, feeling the familiar surge of pride in what I'd accomplished. The business that had saved me, that had given me purpose beyond grief. My words died in my throat. There, in the 3rd row, sitting between the mayor's wife and the chamber president, was a face I knew better than my own reflection. A face I'd kissed goodbye on a Tuesday morning 15 years ago. A face I'd identified in the county morgue 3 days later, my hands shaking as I signed papers confirming that yes, this was my husband, Calvin James Blackwood. The crystal award slipped from my fingers, hitting the podium with a sharp crack that echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom. My legs buckled beneath me, and I gripped the podium's edges so tightly my knuckles went white. The room spun like a carnival ride, faces blurring into streaks of color while a high-pitched ringing filled my ears, drowning out the concerned murmurs from the audience. My name is Irene Blackwood. I'm 73 years old, and this is the story of how my husband faked his death to escape our marriage and his debts, then returned 15 years to claim half the business I built while believing I was a widow. If you've ever discovered that your entire life was built on a lie told by someone you trusted completely, share in the comments where you're watching from and how you found the strength to rebuild. Calvin, my dead husband Calvin, was applauding. Actually applauding, as if this were perfectly normal. As if he hadn't been buried in Riverside Cemetery for 15 years while I'd visited his grave every month, leaving fresh flowers and updates about the business I'd built from nothing. Mrs. Blackwood? The event coordinator appeared at my elbow, her young face creased with concern. Are you all right? Do you need to sit down? I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The taste of copper filled my mouth. I'd bitten my cheek without realizing it. My chest felt compressed, as if someone had wrapped steel bands around my ribs and was slowly tightening them. Each shallow breath brought less oxygen than the last. I started, then stopped. What was I? Fine? Clearly not. Seeing things? The concerned faces around me suggested otherwise. Having a stroke? Possible, given the circumstances. Calvin stood up from his seat, and the movement sent another wave of nausea through me. He looked older, of course, 15 years older, but unmistakably him. The same slight stoop to his shoulders, the same way of adjusting his tie when he was nervous. He was even wearing the blue suit I'd bought him for our 20th anniversary, the one I donated to charity after his funeral because seeing it in the closet was too painful. He began moving toward the stage, and I watched in horrified fascination as people stepped aside to let him pass. They could see him too. This wasn't a grief-induced hallucination or a stress-related breakdown. This was real. Irene, he called out, his voice carrying across the ballroom with that familiar slight rasp from years of smoking. Irene, it's all right. I can explain everything. Explain everything. The man I'd buried, whose life insurance had barely covered his funeral expenses after the creditors took their share, whose death had forced me to sell everything we'd owned, just to keep from declaring bankruptcy. He wanted to explain everything. The event coordinator was speaking into her headset, probably calling for medical assistance. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing a medical emergency or a family reunion. The mayor's wife had her phone out, likely recording what would become the most bizarre Chamber of Commerce event in Riverside's history. I straightened slowly, my spine finding its strength vertebra by vertebra. The steel bands around my chest loosened just enough to allow a full breath. When I spoke, my voice carried clearly through the full room sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption. It appears my late husband has decided to attend tonight's ceremony. A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. Calvin had reached the base of the stage now, looking up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Guilt? Anticipation? Something that looked disturbingly like calculation. "Hello, Irene," he said, loud enough for the front rows to hear. "You've done well for yourself." The hotel bar was mercifully dim, its amber lighting hiding the tremor in my hands as I gripped my untouched glass of wine. Calvin sat across from me in the burgundy leather booth, looking as comfortable as if we were discussing weekend plans instead of his resurrection from the dead. "You look good, Irene," he said, stirring his whiskey with the same methodical precision I remembered. "Successful? I always knew you had it in you." The casual tone, as if 15 years of grief and struggle were merely an extended business trip, sent heat rushing from my stomach to my face. "You always knew I had what in me, Calvin? The ability to pay off $3,420,000 in debts you hid from me? The strength to lose our home while you were where exactly? Arizona, mostly. Scottsdale's lovely this time of year." He took a sip, completely unbothered by my rising voice. "I had to disappear, Irene. Some people I owed money to weren't the patient type, if you understand my meaning. So you let me think you were dead." The words felt foreign in my mouth, like speaking a language I'd never learned. "You let me identify a body. Whose body was that, Calvin?" "John Doe. From the county morgue. Similar build, similar age. Amazing what a little dental work and some strategic arrangements can accomplish." He said it like he was describing a home renovation project. I needed a clean slate. My chest constricted again, that familiar steel band sensation, but this time anger burned beneath it. A clean slate. While I worked 3 jobs to pay off gambling debts you'd hidden from me. While I lost the house my grandmother left me. While I cried myself to sleep for 2 years because I thought the love of my life was gone. Now, Irene, let's not be dramatic. You clearly landed on your feet. That's quite an impressive business you've built. His eyes held a calculating gleam I'd never noticed during our marriage, or perhaps I'd been too accommodating to see it. 35 employees, you said? Offices in 3 states? The way he said it, like he was appraising livestock, made my skin crawl. What do you want, Calvin? Want? He laughed, the sound hollow in the bar's intimate space. I want to reconnect with my wife. I want to understand how you've managed to build such a successful enterprise. I want to discuss our future. Our future? The words came out as a whisper. Calvin, you've been legally dead for 15 years. I buried you. I grieved you. I rebuilt my entire life believing you were gone. Ugh. But that's where things get interesting. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, sliding it across the table like a dinner check. I've consulted with an attorney. Since we were never legally divorced, and since I was never actually dead, absent, we're still married, which means I'm entitled to half of all marital assets acquired during our union. My hands went numb. The envelope sat between us like a coiled snake. Marital assets. Calvin, you were dead. Legally dead. I built that business from nothing, with no help from anyone. But you built it while married to me. That makes it community property. His smile was the same one he'd used when explaining why he needed to borrow money from my savings account, why his poker nights were investments, why his business ventures required just a little more capital. My attorney assures me I have a very strong case. The room tilted slightly, and I gripped the table edge. 15 years of 18-hour days, of building client relationships through integrity and hard work, of creating something meaningful from the ashes of my old life. And he wanted half of it simply because he'd managed to fake his death convincingly enough to fool everyone, including me. "You can't be serious." But even as I said it, I could see he was completely serious. This wasn't a reunion or an apology. This was a business proposition. "I'm very serious, Irene. I've done my research. Blackwood Financial Consulting is valued at approximately $4.8 million. Half of that would set me up quite nicely for my retirement years." He finished his whiskey and signaled the bartender for another. "Of course, I'm willing to be reasonable about the terms. We could work out some kind of payment plan." Payment plan. As if my life's work was a debt I owed him for the privilege of believing he was dead. "I need to go." I stood on unsteady legs, leaving my wine untouched. The bar suddenly felt suffocating, thick with the scent of his cologne and the weight of his expectations. "Think about it, Irene. We can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way, I'm getting what's rightfully mine." His voice followed me as I walked toward the exit. "I'll be in touch soon to discuss the details." Outside, the cool evening air hit my face like a slap. I stood on the sidewalk, watching normal people live their normal lives. Couples walking hand in hand, families heading to dinner, teenagers laughing over shared phones. None of them had dead husbands demanding half their life's work. My phone buzzed. A text from my niece Hazel. "Aunt Irene, are you okay? Someone posted a video of what happened at the ceremony. Call me." I stared at the screen, realizing that Calvin's return wasn't just my private nightmare anymore. By tomorrow, everyone would know that Irene Blackwood, the woman who'd built a business empire from tragedy, had been living a lie for 15 years. And Calvin was counting on exactly that kind of pressure to make me cooperate. I sat in my home office at 3 in the morning, surrounded by boxes I hadn't opened in years. The house felt different now, not the sanctuary I'd built from scratch, but a museum of lies. Every framed photo, every piece of furniture, every carefully chosen decoration suddenly seemed tainted by the knowledge that my entire foundation was false. The box, labeled Calvin Personal Effects, sat open on my desk, its contents spread across the mahogany surface like evidence at a crime scene. His watch, the one I'd had engraved for our 10th anniversary, his college ring, the wallet I'd kept because it still smelled like his cologne. But it was the insurance paperwork that made my hands shake as I held it up to the desk lamp. The life insurance policy I'd cashed out to pay for his funeral. $50,000 that had barely covered the costs after his creditors took their share. I'd read this document dozens of times 15 years ago, but now I was seeing it with different eyes. The beneficiary's signature looked wrong. Too neat, too careful. Calvin's actual signature was always rushed, sloppy from years of signing checks quickly before I could ask too many questions about where the money was going. The signature was deliberate, practiced. My phone rang, startling me from my examination. The caller ID showed Walter Jenkins, Calvin's best friend since college, the man who'd delivered the eulogy at the funeral, who'd held my hand during the burial, who'd checked on me weekly for months afterward. "Irene, I heard about tonight. Are you all right?" Walter's voice carried the same concerned tone he'd used during those awful first months after Calvin's death. But now, something in his inflection made my stomach clench. A careful quality, like he was choosing each word deliberately. "Walter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Did you know Calvin was alive?" The silence stretched so long, I thought the call had dropped. When Walter finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Irene, did you know?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, cutting through whatever excuse he was preparing. "It's complicated." Those two words hit me like a physical blow. My chest constricted, but this time it wasn't panic. It was rage, pure and clean and clarifying. "Complicated? Walter," I cried on your shoulder. "Your wife brought me casseroles for months. You helped me sort through Calvin's things. You knew he was alive, and you let me grieve a ghost." He said he'd explain everything when the time was right. He said it was temporary, just until he could sort out his problems. Walter's words tumbled out in a rush. We never thought it would go on this long. We? The word felt like ice in my mouth. Who else knew? Another silence. Then, Ethel knew. And Raymond, Calvin's cousin Raymond. He helped with the arrangements. The room spun, but not from shock. This time, from understanding. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Walter and Ethel Jenkins, who'd been our closest friends for 20 years. Raymond Foster, who'd handled Calvin's estate and helped me navigate the legal maze of his debts. They'd all known. The body I identified, I said slowly. You were there with me, Walter. You held my hand while I looked at a stranger's face and confirmed it was my husband. The dental records were falsified by people you helped Calvin find. I stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked the garden I'd planted in Calvin's memory. 15 years of tending roses I'd chosen because they were his favorite color. How much did he pay you? Irene, it wasn't like that. How much? My voice cut through his protests like a blade. He covered some debts we had, medical bills from Ethel's surgery, but we never wanted to hurt you. Medical bills. Of course, Calvin had always been good at finding people's pressure points, their vulnerabilities. He'd probably presented himself as their savior while positioning me as an obstacle to overcome. You watched me lose everything, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. You watched me work myself into the ground, paying off his gambling debts. You came to the business awards when I started winning recognition for what I'd built. You celebrated my success, knowing it was all based on a lie you helped create. We wanted to tell you so many times, but you didn't, because it was easier to let me live the lie than face the consequences of what you'd done. I turned away from the window, my reflection in the dark glass showing a woman I barely recognized. Not the grieving widow or the accommodating wife, but someone harder, clearer. How long has Calvin been planning to come back? I don't know what you mean. Walter, don't insult my intelligence. Not now. He didn't just randomly decide to show up at my award ceremony. He's been watching, waiting, probably getting updates from all of you about how successful the business became. The silence confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't a spontaneous reunion. This was a calculated move by a man who'd spent 15 years letting me build something valuable while he lived, consequence-free, and now he wanted to collect his share. He's going to try to take half my business, I said. Irene, I'm sure if you just talk to him. I hung up. For the first time in 15 years, I felt completely awake. The law offices of Morrison & Associates occupied the top floor of Riverside's tallest building, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city. I'd helped shape through 15 years of business development. I sat across from Patricia Morrison, the attorney who'd handled my business incorporation and several major client contracts, watching her review the documents I'd brought. This is extraordinary, Patricia said, adjusting her reading glasses as she examined Calvin's legal filing. I've seen plenty of unusual cases, but a spouse returning from the dead to claim marital assets. This is a first. My hands rested calmly in my lap. No tremor, no nervous fidgeting. The panic that had consumed me 3 days ago had crystallized into something far more useful: strategic focus. What are my options? Well, the good news is that your business was established entirely after Calvin's legal death. You used no marital assets, no joint accounts, no shared resources. Everything was built independently. Patricia flipped through the incorporation papers. The bad news is that he's technically correct about still being legally married to you. His death was never officially confirmed, just presumed based on fraudulent evidence. So he has a claim? He thinks he does. But there's a significant problem with his position. Patricia leaned forward, her expression sharpening. By faking his death and allowing you to collect life insurance benefits, he committed insurance fraud. By assuming a false identity for 15 years, he committed identity theft. By abandoning his legal obligations while letting you shoulder his debts, he committed financial exploitation. I felt my spine straightening, vertebra by vertebra. Meaning, For the first time since Calvin's reappearance, I smiled back. What do we need to prove that? Meaning that any attempt to claim marital assets could expose him to serious criminal charges. The statute of limitations hasn't run out on insurance fraud of this magnitude. Patricia smiled grimly. He's essentially trying to profit from his own criminal activity. Documentation. Evidence of the fraud, the false identity, the deliberate abandonment. Do you have access to any of the original insurance paperwork? Patricia's eyebrows rose as she examined the papers. You've been thorough. I opened my briefcase, the same leather case I'd carried to every important business meeting for the past decade, and pulled out a manila folder. I kept everything: insurance documents, death certificate, dental records, correspondence with creditors. I also have 15 years of business records showing every dollar earned and invested. I learned to be, when you're rebuilding from nothing, documentation becomes survival. I pulled out another folder. I also have this, a recording of my conversation with Walter Jenkins 3 nights ago, where he admitted to knowing Calvin was alive and helping maintain the deception. I've been recording all my conversations since Calvin reappeared. Old habit from business negotiations: always protect yourself with documentation. I met her gaze steadily. I may have been naive 15 years ago, but I'm not that woman anymore. You recorded that conversation? A second marriage? Patricia's voice sharpened. That's bigamy. Patricia nodded approvingly. What else do you have? I hired a private investigator yesterday. Former FBI, specializes in financial fraud. He's already traced Calvin's activities in Arizona bank accounts under his assumed name, property purchases, even a second marriage that was never legally dissolved. I placed another folder on her desk. Calvin's been living quite comfortably while I was paying off his debts. Among other things, the investigator also found evidence that Calvin's been monitoring my business success through social media and local news coverage. This wasn't a chance encounter. It was a planned extraction. I watched Patricia process the information, her legal mind already calculating angles and strategies. This was familiar territory for me now. The careful analysis, the strategic planning, the methodical building of an unassailable position. The same skills I'd used to build my business were serving me well in dismantling Calvin's scheme. There's something else, I continued. I want to confront him directly, with witnesses present. I want him to admit what he's done, on record. That's risky. He might not cooperate. He will. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the solid weight of my own certainty. Calvin's always been arrogant. He thinks he's the smartest person in any room, and he can't resist explaining how clever he's been. If I approach this right, he'll confess everything just to prove how brilliantly he orchestrated it all. Patricia studied me with new interest. You've thought this through. I stood up, gathering my folders with the same efficiency I used in board meetings. I want to arrange a meeting. Calvin, Walter, Ethel, Raymond, all of them together. I want them face what they've done, and I want it documented. And if Calvin refuses to meet, I've had 3 sleepless nights to think it through. Calvin made one crucial mistake. He underestimated who I became after he left. He's expecting the same woman who used to apologize for asking where the grocery money went. Instead, he's dealing with someone who's spent 15 years making strategic decisions under pressure. He won't refuse. He thinks he holds all the cards. He thinks I'm still the grieving widow who'll do anything to avoid conflict. I moved toward the door, then paused. He's about to discover that the woman who built a $4.8 million business from a card table doesn't back down from bullies anymore. Tomorrow, it's time to end this charade. Patricia smiled. I'll start preparing the criminal fraud documentation. When do you want to schedule this confrontation? The conference room at Morrison & Associates felt like a courtroom as I entered, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor with steady, measured steps. Calvin sat at the far end of the mahogany table, flanked by Walter and Ethel Jenkins. Raymond Foster occupied the chair beside them, all 4 looking like defendants awaiting sentencing. Patricia Morrison sat to my right, a digital recorder positioned prominently in the center of the table. Detective Sarah Chen from the fraud division occupied the chair beside her, her badge and notepad visible reminders that this wasn't just a family discussion anymore. "Thank you all for coming," I said, settling into my chair with the same composure I developed through hundreds of business negotiations. No tremor in my voice, no apologetic qualifiers. I thought it was time we had an honest conversation about the last 15 years. Calvin leaned back in his chair, that familiar calculating smile playing at his lips. "Irene, I hope you've had time to consider my proposal. My attorney assures me we can reach a reasonable settlement." "Your attorney?" I interrupted, my voice cutting through his practiced charm like a blade. "The same attorney who advised you that faking your death to collect insurance money was legal. Or perhaps a different one who specializes in bigamy cases." The smile faltered. Ethel's face went pale. Walter shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," Calvin began. "I know exactly what I've discovered." I opened the folder in front of me, pulling out a photograph. "This is you and Margaret Sinclair at your wedding ceremony in Scottsdale, Arizona, June 15, 2018. Lovely ceremony. From what I can see, of course you were still legally married to me at the time, which makes it bigamy." I placed another document on the table. "This is the bank account you opened under the name Charles Brennan in 2010, 3 months before your supposed death. The account that received $107,000 in transfers from various gambling associates, money you owed them, money that became my responsibility when you died." Calvin's composure was cracking, but his arrogance remained intact. "You can't prove any connection between—" "Actually, I can." I slid a thick folder across the table. Fingerprint analysis, handwriting samples, photographic evidence spanning 15 years. The FBI takes insurance fraud very seriously, Calvin. Especially when it involves this much money and this much premeditation. Detective Chen spoke for the first time. "Mr. Blackwood, you have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "This is ridiculous," Calvin snapped, his mask finally slipping completely. "I had no choice. Those people would have killed me. I did what I had to do to survive." "By letting me believe you were dead." My voice remained steady, but steel ran through every word. "By watching me lose our home while you started a new life. By letting me work myself into the ground paying debts that legally died with you. You survived, didn't you?" Calvin's true nature was emerging now, the callous opportunist I'd been too accommodating to see during our marriage. "Look what you accomplished. You should be thanking me." The audacity of it took my breath away for a moment. Then I laughed, a sound I barely recognized as my own. "Thanking you? For 15 years of grief? For the stress-induced hypertension that requires daily medication? For the nights I couldn't sleep because I was terrified of losing everything?" I turned to Walter and Ethel, who sat frozen in their chairs. "And you two, you watched me struggle. You brought casseroles and sympathy cards while knowing it was all based on lies. You celebrated my business success, knowing I'd built it on the foundation of your deception." Ethel finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "We never meant for it to go on so long. But it did go on. For 15 years. And now Calvin thinks he can waltz back into my life and claim half of what I built, while believing I was a widow." I stood up, my full height commanding the room. "Let me be very clear about something. The business was established entirely after your legal death, Calvin. Every client relationship, every contract, every dollar of revenue was earned independently. You have no claim to any of it." "We'll see what the courts say about that," Calvin blustered, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "The courts will say that you can't profit from your own criminal activity," Patricia interjected smoothly. "They'll also say that attempting to claim assets through fraud constitutes additional criminal charges." I placed my hands flat on the table, leaning forward slightly. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to retract your claim to my business immediately. You're going to cooperate fully with the FAD investigation, and you're going to disappear from my life permanently. And if I refuse, then Detective Chen will arrest you for insurance fraud. identity theft, bigamy, and financial exploitation. The evidence is overwhelming, Calvin. Your only choice is how much additional damage you want to inflict on yourself. Calvin looked around the table, finally understanding that his carefully planned extraction had become a trap. The man who'd thought himself so clever, so superior, was facing the consequences of underestimating the woman he abandoned. "You've changed," he said finally, his voice hollow. "Yes," I replied, my voice resonating with 15 years of hard-won strength. "I have. The question is whether you're smart enough to accept that reality." Detective Chen reached for her handcuffs. "Mr. Blackwood, I think it's time we continued this conversation downtown." 6 months later, I stood in the same conference room where I'd confronted Calvin, but this time the atmosphere was celebratory. My 35 employees filled the space, their faces bright with excitement as I prepared to announce the expansion that would take Blackwood Financial Consulting into 2 additional states. "When I started this business 15 years ago," I began, my voice carrying the confidence that had become second nature, "I thought I was simply trying to survive. I never imagined we'd grow into the regional powerhouse we are today, or that we'd be in a position to help thousands of women rebuild their financial lives." The applause was warm, genuine. These people had worked alongside me through the chaos of Calvin's return, had witnessed my transformation from shaken victim back to empowered leader. They'd seen me refuse to let his attempted manipulation derail everything we'd built together. But recent events have taught me something important about the difference between surviving and thriving. Surviving is what you do when you're reacting to circumstances beyond your control. Thriving is what happens when you refuse to let other people's choices define your future. My assistant manager, Jennifer, raised her hand. "What's the latest on the legal situation?" "Calvin pled guilty to insurance fraud and identity theft last month. He'll serve 18 months in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The restitution he owes will ensure he never profits from his deception." I paused, letting that sink in. More importantly, the case has been closed. Blackwood Financial Consulting's ownership and assets are completely secure. The relief in the room was palpable. These people had invested their careers in our company, and Calvin's attempted theft had threatened their livelihoods as much as mine. "There's something else I want to share with you," I continued. "We're establishing the Blackwood Foundation for Financial Recovery, a nonprofit dedicated to helping women rebuild after financial betrayal. Whether it's divorce, death, or deception, no woman should have to navigate financial devastation alone." The idea had crystallized during those sleepless nights after Calvin's return, when I'd realized how many women faced similar situations without the resources or knowledge to fight back. My experience, painful as it was, could become a roadmap for others. After the meeting, I walked through our offices with new eyes. The restored Victorian building I'd purchased 5 years ago, the custom furniture chosen to create a welcoming environment for vulnerable clients, the awards lining the walls, all of it represented choices I'd made independently, decisions that reflected my values rather than someone else's manipulation. My phone buzzed with a text from my niece, Hazel. "Saw the news coverage about the foundation? Grandma would be so proud of who you've become." Grandma. The woman who'd taught me that strength wasn't about never falling down. It was about getting back up with more wisdom than you had before. She'd been gone for 20 years, but her keys had guided me through the darkest moments of rebuilding. That evening, I drove to Riverside Cemetery for the first time since Calvin's return. The headstone I'd purchased with money I couldn't afford still stood in the family plot, but now it felt like a monument to my own naivety rather than a memorial to lost love. I knelt beside the grave, not in grief this time, but in acknowledgement. "I spent 15 years mourning someone who never existed," I said aloud, my voice steady in the twilight air. The Calvin I thought I'd lost was a fiction. The real Calvin was a man who could watch me suffer and feel nothing but opportunity. A gentle breeze stirred the oak leaves overhead, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace, not the fragile peace of denial or the exhausted peace of survival, but the solid peace of someone who'd faced the worst and emerged stronger. "But here's what he never understood," I continued, standing and brushing dirt from my knees. When you force someone to rebuild from nothing, you teach them they can survive anything. When you abandon someone at their lowest point, you show them they don't need you to thrive. I walked back to my car, leaving the headstone behind without a backward glance. Tomorrow, I'd have it removed and donate the plot to someone who needed it. Calvin's story was over, but mine was just beginning its next chapter. At home, I opened my laptop and began typing the first blog post for the Foundation's website. My name is Irene Blackwood. I'm 73 years old, and I want to tell you about the difference between being a victim and being a survivor. For 15 years, I thought I was a widow who'd overcome tragedy through determination and hard work. Last year, I discovered I was actually a woman who'd been systematically deceived by everyone she trusted. The difference matters more than you might think. A widow grieves and rebuilds. A woman betrayed by her community fights back and transforms not just herself, but the systems that enabled her exploitation. If you're reading this because someone you trusted has shattered your financial security, I want you to know something. You are stronger than you realize, smarter than they assume, and more capable than they want you to believe. Your age is not a limitation, it's an advantage. You have decades of experience, wisdom, and resilience they can't match. The question isn't whether you can rebuild. The question is what kind of life you want to build, and who you want to become in the process. I hit publish and leaned back in my chair, watching the cursor blink on the screen. Somewhere out there, another woman was discovering that her life had been built on lies. But now she wouldn't have faced that discovery alone. That was Calvin's real legacy. Not the pain he'd caused, but the strength he'd forced me to find.